Before we go any further about our discussion in the area of ethics, I do want to point out something. I want you to be aware there's a difference between sophistry and philosophy. Many times people mistake the one for the other. Many times people think that they are engaged in philosophy and they're not. They're engaged in sophistry. It was really a very negative term that was used in the ancient world to talk about people who use their skills in philosophy and rhetoric in order to prove a point that they were not necessarily thinking was true. It did not matter if it was true. They just wanted to play the game of philosophy. And philosophy is not a game. Philosophy is the search for truth. It uses logic just like sophistry does, but it does not really try to prove a point. Instead, it's trying to seek what is the point that needs to be made. It tries to seek the truth itself. So be very careful when it comes to the area of sophistry versus philosophy, especially when it comes to the area of ethics. Ethics is a very important area in philosophy. The atheistic philosopher or materialistic philosopher by the name of Luc Ferry says that basically ethics is the goal of philosophy. How do we live our lives? It is there in which he says you live the saved life. He says the good life is what leads basically to salvation. And this comes from the materialistic philosopher Luc Ferry, who was professor of philosophy at the University of Paris in Sorbonne. So let's be careful as we deal with these issues that we're dealing with them legitimately, seeking the truth and not trying to prove a point we already believe to be the truth. In our earlier discussion, we were talking about doing the right thing. What should we murder innocent Jewish children, for example, in the Holocaust of the World War II? These are issues. We'll be looking at different approaches to ethics. The first one is called the Deontological Ethic. The ontological ethic is basically saying that we have a duty to do the right thing. It does not matter whether the right thing leads to something good for me or something bad for me. It does not matter. It is going to be important that I do the right thing. I do my duty. This is coming from Immanuel Kant, who very much promoted deontological ethics. He talks very much about the categorical imperative, which hopefully if you take the course on ethics, you'll study more about it. Now, there are some subdivisions within deontological ethics. One is very familiar to most of you. It's called the divine command theory. You may have not heard of the actual name before, but you're familiar with it. If you come from a mosque, a synagogue, or a temple, a church, you'll hear many times what God wants you to do. This is basically saying that right and wrong are determined by God, that God is the one who decides what is right and wrong. It's very much coming out of the third model, transcendence. So it's looking then at basically the claim that all ethics comes from God himself. I want to go back to the discussion of the movie The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. Most of you have already seen this or will one day. And again, basically in that movie we saw where the father of Bruno, who is the commandant of a concentration camp, he's in this terrible argument with his wife. His wife is really upset with him that he's involved in such behavior. And so therefore, whenever she confronts him, he tries to justify himself. He tries to excuse his behavior. And one of his justifications is that he claims that he is a soldier. And as a soldier, he promised to obey his commanders. Even if it means obeying an evil command, it doesn't matter. He had to obey his superior officer. So the question is, should I obey an evil law or should a soldier obey an evil command? For example, I may not be a soldier, but suppose the Supreme Court says something is the law, that is constitutional, or maybe the Congress passes a law and says we should obey it. Should I necessarily obey it because Congress passed a law or because the Supreme Court said it is constitutional? This also leads to another issue. Suppose I do not obey the law. Well, what would happen to me? Basically, if I were a soldier in Nazi Germany, there could be some very severe consequences. And so therefore, for example, the commandant, if he had disobeyed the orders from his superior officers, Consequences could have been basically he was put to death. If he was lucky, he'd be tortured, which is worse, or thrown in a concentration camp for a long period of time. Or even worse, maybe his family is put to death, or maybe even they're tortured. And so therefore, the question becomes, should he look at the consequences of his actions in making his decision of what he should do? If a person such as the soldier or anybody else bases their actions upon what they believe to be the consequences, the result is they are another area of ethics. It's no longer deontological ethics. It's called consequentialism or utilitarianism, according to John Stuart Mills. And basically, this is morality that's being determined by the consequences of the action. That I go, okay, if this action leads to a good result, then I should do it, no matter whether the action itself may be construed or being viewed as being wrong. In this kind of situation, when somebody is using consequentialism as a way to determine what to do, they're saying that the end justifies the means. It was all said and done, it doesn't matter how it got to the good result. Just as long as it got to the good result, that's all that matters. This is called consequentialism. You'll also hear it spoken of another way. For example, people will say that we do the things that promote the most good for the most number of people. Minority may suffer, but it doesn't matter, just as long as the majority is experiencing goodness as a result of these actions. This is called consequentialism. The problem with consequentialism is that it can be used to justify what most people would call evil actions. For example, slavery. There's still slavery in the world today, and there was slavery in the United States until 1865, and the argument can be made that the most number of people were benefited by slavery in the South, and also it benefited those up north because they used the raw materials of the South for their different industries. But do we want to have slavery? Same thing with genocide. You see Hitler going, basically he wants a great country. Which president, which world leader does not want their country to be great? But is genocide the way to do it? Conquest, abortion. We can say, well, the consequences are bad if I don't have an abortion, but does abortion then justify the good consequence of basically financial stability, or maybe the mother is not worried by having a child at an early age? So all these are different actions which can be used to, we can justify using them if we say the results are good. But do people really want to go there? Do they really want to justify some action by using slavery? Using slavery as a means to good ends. That presents a lot of problems. As we delve deeper into the area of morality, we're coming to what we call the four cardinal virtues. You go, why are they called the cardinal virtues? Well, they're not like the bird, red cardinals. They're not coming out of Roman Catholicism. We have cardinals in Roman Catholicism. No. Instead, what we're looking at is the word actually literally means hinge. Like the door is connected to the door frame by a hinge. So all ethics is going to hinge upon these four cardinal virtues, the four hinges. The first one is prudence. Prudence is basically thinking ahead and thinking about the consequences of your action. Now, it's more than just consequentialism. But for example, you're there taking a test, and you go, what should I do for this test? It's coming up. Well, I think ahead. I need to study today. I will study today. I'll work hard. I'll study every day between now and the test so I can make a good grade on the test. I want a good grade, therefore I will study. That's being a prudent person. Temperance means moderation in all areas of life. Now, many times, people who are very critical of other people, they are moderate in the areas they criticize other people for, but they're not moderate in their own areas. For example, if somebody may walk by and they smell like smoke, they may smell like alcohol, and maybe some people start criticizing them. I've seen this happen sometimes in religious settings. But the person criticizing them weighs like 300 pounds because they never passed by a bucket of fried chicken. Well, ladies and gentlemen, although they may be temperate when it comes to smoking, to alcohol, are they being temperate when it comes to food? Temperance relates to every area of life. It's called actually the gateway to all kinds of evils. Because if you don't have control of yourself personally, physically, basically being soft in that area may be being soft in other areas as well. Justice is doing the right thing. It doesn't matter what the consequences are. You do the right thing. And hopefully, prayerfully, that the good consequences will eventually emerge from you doing the right thing, justice. Courage is doing the right thing in spite of any negative consequences which might follow. For example, you're taking a test. Well, if I don't cheat, I won't make a good grade on the test. I've got to make a good grade on the test. I need to stay on the football team, basketball team, soccer, you name it. I just cannot fail. Well, that's maybe true. You may fail, but the courageous person is actually going to say, I don't care what the consequences are. I will take what comes. I'm going to do the right thing, even though I may be fearful. Being afraid does not mean that you're a coward. Being afraid and letting your fears control you, that leads to cowardice, but not simply the feeling of fear. That is just common to anybody. It's also something that helps lead us to wisdom. C.S. Lewis, though, is going to single out wisdom. Aristotle himself said, you will never do anything in this world without courage. And basically he's talking about anything really noble, anything really good. C.S. Lewis said courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, which means at the highest point of reality. Basically saying that, it's okay and it's good to do good when there's no cost involved. There's nothing wrong with that. But the courageous person is somebody who does good even when they may lose something very important to them. There may be a loss of job, or it may be a loss of health, a loss of a loved one. You do the right thing. For example, the commandant, if he had demonstrated courage, he would not have been sacrificing, killing innocent Jewish children. So basically, there comes a point in life in which it is not easy to do the right thing. When it is hard to do the right thing. And that's when courage kicks in. And it is ultimately the courageous person that will be the good person. Being good when there's no cost, there's no value in that. There's nothing praiseworthy about that. It is when you do good, no matter what the consequences, negative consequences, that leads to the good person. We've looked at deontological ethics. We've also looked at consequentialism. Now we're coming to the third major area of ethics. Basically, the answer to this question is going to help us understand about virtue ethics. What am I, though, if I do or don't do something because I'm afraid of the consequences? What would I say about myself or somebody else? For example, I'm put in the situation, I must exterminate innocent children in order for me to live or for my family to live. Very quickly, before I answer that question, I do want to deal with one issue. Suppose I don't do what I'm told to do, or I do something that I'm told not to do, and it leads to the death of my family. For example, Hitler says, your family's killed because you did not do the right thing. You did not do what I wanted you to do. Am I then responsible for the death of my family? Many people would say yes, but the real answer is no. No, the one who killed my family is responsible for the death of my family, not me. The one who did evil is responsible for the evil, not the one who did good. But we're back to the question, what am I, though, if I do or don't do something because I'm afraid of the consequences? Basically, the answer may be offensive to some, but philosophy does not try to soft pedal things, it tries to tell the truth. It's truth that leads to joy, not believing in deception according to philosophy. Basically, if I don't do the right thing, then because I'm afraid, that makes me a coward. We're now in another major area of ethics. Probably one of the greatest tragedies of the last 200 years was the sinking of the Titanic. Extraordinary loss of life, unnecessary loss of life. When they built the boat, they claimed it was unsinkable, that God himself could not sink it. And as a result, they did not put many lifeboats on the boat. So when the ship began to sink, only women and children from the upper class were put into the boats. Now, there were a lot of courageous people on that boat. For example, one of the wealthiest men in the world, John Jacob Astor, was on that boat. He could have basically bought all the boats and saved him and everyone to save, including himself. But he was a noble person. He went, no, if I take a seat, I've deprived a woman or child of that seat. So he refused to take a seat, and he went down the ship. And he's considered a courageous person because of that. On the other hand, in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a picture of Bruce Ismay. Bruce Ismay was actually a member of the White Star Company that built Titanic, and it was his vision to come up with a ship like Titanic. When the ship started going down, he weaseled his way into getting one of the officers of the lifeboats to let him to get on the lifeboat and save himself. He took up the place of another woman or child that could have been there, but because of his cowardice, he made sure he got onto the lifeboat. Over 1,000 people died as a result of this. In fact, Bruce Ismay was the one who kept pressing the captain to go faster and faster and faster. This led then to running into the iceberg and the death of all his people. Now, he survived the sinking of the Titanic. But that's all we can say about Bruce Ismay, that he survived. He just basically, from that point on, just existed. He lived, but he didn't have a life. In fact, he was pillared by the press. He was made fun of. Every kind of slur was cast at him. Again, he lived, but he did not really live as a result of his cowardice. This area of ethics we actually call virtue ethics. What we do has a major impact on what we become. And this is a system highly promoted by Aristotle, Augustine, and Confucius. All of them really emphasize being virtuous people. When we're virtuous people, we will do the right thing. We have that character of virtue. We will do the right thing. And we do the right thing, it helps us become the person who is virtuous. This is very important also in the area of the existentialism of the materialistic philosophers, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus. These were existentialists. And basically we're becoming something, and our actions are developing us into somebody. If we live in fear, we become cowards. Not that we're afraid, but do we let our fears control us and become cowards? If we do acts of bravery, even though we may fear, we're becoming a courageous, brave person. We're becoming somebody, virtue ethics. One thing you need to understand about virtue ethics, you are creating yourself into being somebody. I can guarantee you there's one person in life you will live with your entire life. And if there's life beyond the grave, you'll live with that person forever also. And that person is you. Young people are very fortunate in that they can change. It's not hard for them to change. Sometimes it is, but it's not that hard to change. When you get older, you become set in your ways. You become almost like a statue. And the result is very hard to change. Not that it's impossible to change, but it's very hard to change. So therefore, you may want to look at the trajectory of your life and go, where will this lead me? Will I become the kind of person I will want to live with permanently here on earth and maybe also in the future after the grave? Let's go back to the story of the boy in striped pajamas and the commandant. We're talking about bravery here. We're talking about basically if I do the right thing, what will be the consequences? I do the right thing, I may suffer. Sometimes people will say this: it doesn't matter what I do. No matter what I do, it will not make a difference. For example, I may say, if I do the right thing, such as resist Hitler, I will not make a difference. I'll still be put to death, and the Jewish children will be exterminated. That's probably cowardice speaking. The fact is, there is nothing 100% definite. Now, if you had resisted Hitler, you had a 99.999999999% chance of basically suffering, being put to death, or your family suffering or being put to death. The odds were not in your favor. But never say that anything is 100% provable or definite. It's not. There's what's called catalyst. A catalyst, as most of you know, is used in a scientific experiment. You have all these elements in a test tube, but nothing's happening. All of a sudden you put in a catalyst and it triggers a chemical reaction and something new is produced from it. All the elements were there, but it needed a catalyst. And that catalyst is what made the difference. In history, we have seen great catalysts emerge. For example, Rosa Parks was a catalyst. There were people in the South, in the North, across the nation. They did not like what was going on in the Deep South. They did not like to see the segregation going on here. And Rosa Parks stirred the imaginations and the hearts of people when she said she was not going to sit in the back of the bus, which had been assigned to her. Instead, she was going to sit in the front of the bus. She was equal to the whites who sat in the front of the bus. Martin Luther King Jr. was another great catalyst. Again, there were a lot of people who wanted good things for the blacks in the South, but they needed somebody to emerge as a leader, somebody who could inspire them, and somebody they could basically follow. And he provided that leadership. He really triggered and inspired the minds of so many people. Finally, there's Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. It is incredible what he was able to accomplish. The fact is that Gandhi destroyed the greatest empire the world has ever seen. It is phenomenal what he's able to accomplish. Here's a map of the British Empire. There is nothing like it. It actually controlled 1/4 of the Earth's surface. It stretched all the way from England, there in the kind of middle upright, up to the top, all the way across Canada, with all its great fur, timber, iron, fishing industries. Then you come away, keep going west, then you come back over to the bottom right-hand corner. You'll see New Zealand, Australia, basically great shipping industries. A lot of wealth flowing from Australia. If you go up a little bit into China, you're going to see a city there called Hong Kong. Hong Kong's just a city, but through that city poured the wealth of China flowing into the British Empire. You don't go on, you're going there to India. India alone itself would have been an empire great enough for anybody, but it's one part of the British Empire. India itself produced all these gems, silver, silks, teas. Tea was huge in the world. All these tea plantations. You name it, spices, they all flowed from India into the British Empire. Also, during the 1920s and 30s and 40s, you're seeing the British had a major influence there in the Middle East. Much oil reserves were there, and the result, oil flowed in the British Empire. Then you go to Africa. Basically, you could almost run a train all the way from the southern part of Africa to the very top part of Africa, from Cape Hope there in South Africa, all the way up to Cairo in Egypt. Now, France had as much territory in Africa as England did, but they had sand. The best parts of Africa were given to the British Empire. All the diamonds in South Africa, again, the coffee plantations, tea plantations, all this wealth is flowing from Africa into the British Empire. If you ever go to London one day, you'll see these massive buildings, beautiful buildings, gold, art, treasure, like you've never seen anywhere before. You know, how can that be whenever London is the capital of only 55 million people? Again, the reason is at one point in time, just less than 100 years ago, it was the capital of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. And Gandhi brought it down. How did Gandhi bring down the British Empire? He simply said no. He told his people, do not obey British law. Do not use violence. He promoted civil disobedience. Martin Luther King Jr. said that he was inspired by the actions of Gandhi to use civil disobedience in the South during the early 60s. Gandhi himself got it from the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. He's told the British people, British rulers, we will not obey you. We'll shut down industries. We just won't do anything. We'll not obey your laws. You can beat us. You can kill us. It doesn't matter. Our response to you is no. The British said, but don't you understand? India has a lot of problems. And if we leave, those problems will be worse. And Gandhi responded that, well, yes, there will be problems, but they're India's problems, not England's. And in fact, England was just a guest in India, and they were no longer welcome in India. And as a result of civil disobedience, Gandhi brought down the greatest empire the world has ever seen. Let's conclude now with looking at where this leads us. Many times people just want to focus on ethics itself. But ladies and gentlemen, you can find out that ethics is one part of the entire system. Many people think of philosophy as, well, I believe this in ethics, I believe this in epistemology, I believe this other thing in ontology, world religions, etc. Little do they know that they've created chaos, a hodgepodge for philosophy. Now that's okay, I guess, if you're working out of the second model pantheism. But even then, you're working out of pantheism. Philosophy is like a tree. It's got roots, it's got a trunk, it's got leaves. Now, if you're a good botanist and I brought you a leaf from a tree, you would be able to identify what kind of tree it came from. You can tell me about the kind of bark the tree has. You can tell me also about the roots of the tree. Now, the leaf is not the root, and the leaf is not the trunk, and the trunk is not the leaves, and it's not the roots. They're three separate entities. But by looking at one part of that tree, you can tell about the other parts of the tree. The tree works as a whole. It's the same way with philosophy. In philosophy, you basically have three menus to choose from. First menu is materialism. Again, we look, basically materialism says you have no soul, there's no life after death, and really there's no real way you can justify having ethics. We'll talk more about this when we look at Martin Luther King Jr. And also Friedrich Nietzsche in their writings. Pantheism again says you have a soul. Is there any reason to talk about right and wrong since we're all divine? And there's life after death. The third menu again is transcendence. That there is right and wrong. It comes from the divine being. You have a soul and there's life after death. So as you look at this and as you start believing certain things about ethics, you need to understand this has ramifications, implications for the other areas of philosophy. If you choose one, you're really going into the area of transcendence. If you choose another, you're going more into the area of materialism. So process this very carefully, and thank you very much for working through both of these videos on ethics.